Subscribe to StoryLab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Marco Goff wasn't the type of man who believed in second chances. At 38, he had built his security consulting firm from nothing into a multi-million-dollar operation that specialized in corporate protection and risk assessment. His clients ranged from Fortune 500 companies to government contractors who needed problems solved quietly and efficiently. Marco's reputation was built on two principles: absolute loyalty to those who earned it, and absolute destruction for those who betrayed it. The divorce from Marissa had been finalized 18 months ago, but the wounds were still fresh. Not because he missed her. Marco had stopped loving his ex-wife the moment he discovered her affair, but because she had broken the one rule that mattered most to him. Betrayal was unforgivable. Marissa Skinner had been his college sweetheart, a psychology major with honey blonde hair and a smile that could disarm anyone. They'd married young, built a life together in Denver, and for 12 years, Marco thought they were solid. He'd been wrong. The affair with Cameron Dunlap, a real estate developer she'd met at a charity function, had been going on for 8 months before Marco discovered it. What made it worse was how calculated it had been. Marissa had been moving assets, planning her exit strategy, while still sleeping in their bed and claiming to love him. The divorce had been brutal. Marissa's lawyer had painted Marco as a controlling, emotionally absent husband who traveled too much for work. They tried to take half of everything, including his business. Marco's counterattack had been surgical and devastating. He'd hired the best forensic accountants and investigators money could buy, uncovering Marissa's affair in excruciating detail and proving she'd been planning to leave long before she claimed. In the end, she'd walked away with a modest settlement and a non-disclosure agreement that kept her mouth shut about Marco's business dealings. What Marissa didn't know was that Marco had been keeping tabs on her ever since, not out of love or longing, but because he understood the value of information. Knowledge was power, and power was protection. Through his network of contacts, he knew she'd been living with Cameron in a house in Cherry Hills Village, that they'd gotten engaged 6 months ago, and that Cameron had been pressuring her to cut ties with Marco's family entirely. That family consisted primarily of Jocelyn Goff, Marco's 19-year-old sister. Their parents had died in a car accident when Jocelyn was 14, and Marco had become her legal guardian. She was a sophomore at the University of Colorado Boulder, studying graphic design, and the one person in the world Marco would die for. Jocelyn was smart, independent, and had never liked Marissa, something that had always impressed Marco about his sister's judgment. The relationship between Jocelyn and Marissa had been strained even during the marriage. Marissa had always seen the teenager as an intrusion, a reminder that Marco's loyalty was divided. During the divorce, Marissa had made several cutting remarks about Jocelyn being a burden that had prevented their marriage from reaching its full potential. Marco had filed those comments away, along with every other slight and betrayal. Cameron Dunlap was a different kind of problem. 42 years old, divorced with 2 adult children he barely spoke to, Cameron had built his wealth by developing luxury condominiums and strip malls throughout the Denver metro area. He was handsome in a conventional way, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of practiced charm that worked well in boardrooms and cocktail parties. But Marco's research had revealed a man with anger management issues, a drinking problem he hid well, and a history of aggressive behavior toward women. The signs had been there from the beginning. Cameron's first wife had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, but Marco's contacts in the legal community had provided more details. There had been allegations of domestic violence that were later withdrawn, mysterious accidents that had sent her to the emergency room, and a pattern of psychological abuse that she'd only begun to understand years later. Marco had considered warning Marissa, then decided against it. She'd made her choice, and she would live with the consequences. His only concern was protecting Jocelyn from any spillover. That protection had seemed adequate until 3 weeks ago, when Jocelyn had mentioned that Cameron had been asking questions about her class schedule and work routine. She'd laughed it off, calling him creepy but harmless, but Marco had felt a familiar chill. He'd increased security at her apartment building and made sure she had a direct line to his most trusted associates. It hadn't been enough. Chapter 2. The Call. The phone rang at 2:47 a.m. Mountain Time, while Marco was in his hotel room in Chicago, reviewing security protocols for a corporate client's board retreat. The conference was scheduled to run through the weekend, with Marco delivering the keynote presentation on threat assessment in the digital age the following morning. He'd been looking forward to it. Speaking engagements like this one reinforced his reputation and brought in high-value clients. Marco. Jocelyn's voice was barely recognizable through the tears and panic. Something happened. I need you to come home. Marco was out of bed before she finished the sentence, his mind shifting into the cold, analytical mode that had served him well in crisis situations. Where are you? Are you safe right now? I'm at Sarah's apartment. I drove here after. The words dissolved into sobs. Take a breath, Jock. Tell me what happened. The story came out in fragments. Jocelyn had been studying late at the library when she'd gotten a text from Marissa asking her to stop by the house to pick up some of Marco's belongings that had been accidentally packed away. It was a reasonable request. Marissa had been using similar excuses to maintain contact for months, probably hoping to gather information about Marco's post-divorce life. Jocelyn had arrived at the house around 10 p.m. to find only Cameron there. Marissa was supposedly at her book club, running late. Cameron had invited her in, offered her a drink, and tried to make small talk. Nothing unusual, until he'd started asking personal questions about Marco's work, his travel schedule, and his security systems. When Jocelyn had tried to leave, Cameron had blocked the doorway. What followed was a physical altercation that could have been much worse. Cameron had grabbed her wrist, then shoved her against the wall when she tried to pull away. He'd pressed his body against hers and whispered threats about what would happen if she told anyone, specifically Marco, about their conversation. He said Marco thought he was so tough, but he was 3 states away playing soldier while his little sister learned what real men were like. Jocelyn whispered into the phone. He was drunk, Marco, really drunk. And when I tried to push him away, he grabbed my throat and said this was what happened when my loser brother wasn't around to protect me. Marco's hand tightened on the phone, but his voice remained steady. How did you get away? His phone rang. He let go to answer it, and I ran to my car. I've been driving around for 2 hours. I didn't know what to do. You did exactly right by calling me. Stay where you are. I'm coming home. Marco, I'm scared. What if he comes looking for me? What if he tells Marissa that He won't do anything, Marco said, and for the first time in the conversation, there was something dangerous in his tone. I promise you that. After ending the call with Jocelyn, Marco made several more phone calls. He canceled his conference appearance, rebooked his flight, and arranged for additional security at Jocelyn's apartment. Then he made one more call to a number he'd hoped never to use again. Gilbert? It's Marco Goff. I need a favor. Gilbert Perkins answered on the second ring despite the late hour, his voice alert and professional. Marco, it's been 3 years? About that. Listen, I have a situation that requires your particular skill set. How quickly can you get to Denver? Depends on the situation. Corporate or personal? Personal. Very personal. There was a pause. Gilbert had worked with Marco on several high-stakes corporate security matters, including the extraction of executives from hostile foreign countries and the quiet resolution of kidnapping attempts. He was a former Special Forces operator who now freelanced for clients who needed problems solved with minimal legal complications. His services weren't cheap, and they weren't always legal, but they were always effective. Personal means expensive, Gilbert said finally. Money isn't an issue. How quickly? I could be there by noon tomorrow. But Marco, if this is what I think it is, you need to be sure. Once we start down this road, there's no going back. Marco looked out the hotel window at the Chicago skyline, thinking about his sister's voice, about Cameron Dunlap's hands on her throat, about the threat in those words. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. All right, send me the details. I'll see you tomorrow. After hanging up, Marco tried calling Marissa's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail, the same generic message she'd been using since the divorce. He tried the house phone next. Cameron answered on the 4th ring, his voice slurred with alcohol. Yeah, this is Marco Goff. I think we need to talk. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. Well, the big brother calls. You know, your little sister and I had an interesting conversation tonight. She's got some growing up to do. Where's Marissa? Marissa's not available right now, but I am. And I've got a message for you. Marco, your ex-wife is my problem now, not yours. That includes any family drama you want to drag into our lives. Maybe it's time you focused on your own business and stopped trying to play daddy to a girl who's old enough to handle herself. Marco closed his eyes, fighting the rage that threatened to overwhelm his careful control. Let me be very clear about something, Cameron. My sister is off limits. Completely and permanently off limits. If you ever put your hands on her again, you'll what? Cameron's voice had turned ugly. You'll fly home and teach me a lesson? You're 3 states away, playing dress-up at some business conference while she's here learning about the real world. Stay out of it. Marco, or you're next. The line went dead. Marco stared at the phone for a long moment, then began packing his bags. By morning, he would be home, and he wouldn't be coming alone. Chapter 3. The Professional. Gilbert Perkins stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 220 pounds, most of it muscle maintained through a daily regimen that would have killed most men half his age. At 51, he looked like what he was, a former Delta Force operator who had spent 20 years in the world's worst places, doing things that never made it into official reports. His hair was iron gray, his face was scarred from shrapnel that had missed his left eye by less than an inch, and his pale blue eyes held the kind of emptiness that came from seeing too much and feeling too little. After leaving the military, Gilbert had spent 5 years working private security for multinational corporations, then another 5 building a network of contacts who could solve problems that regular law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't touch. His clients included government agencies, Fortune 500 companies, and individuals wealthy enough to afford his particular brand of problem-solving. Marco had first hired Gilbert 3 years earlier when a corporate competitor had kidnapped the teenage daughter of one of Marco's clients, demanding proprietary security information in exchange for her safe return. The FBI had been brought in, but their approach was too slow and too public for the client's needs. Gilbert had located the girl within 18 hours and extracted her without violence, though the kidnappers had found themselves the subject of an intensive IRS audit that had resulted in lengthy prison sentences for tax evasion. Gilbert's methods were always careful, always deniable, and always effective. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, he didn't judge his client's motivations, and he never left loose ends. His reputation was built on 2 principles: complete discretion and permanent solutions. The meeting took place at Marco's downtown office on Saturday afternoon. The building was empty except for security guards, giving them privacy to discuss matters that couldn't be overheard. Marco's office occupied the entire top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Denver skyline. The decor was expensive but understated: dark wood, leather furniture, and abstract paintings that said nothing about their owner's personality. Gilbert arrived precisely on time, carrying a single black briefcase and wearing the kind of anonymous business suit that made him invisible in crowds. He sat across from Marco's desk and waited without speaking, his pale eyes taking in every detail of the room. "Tell me about Cameron Dunlap," Marco said. Gilbert opened his briefcase and removed a manila folder. Cameron James Dunlap, age 42, divorced, 2 adult children from his first marriage. Net worth approximately $8 million, primarily in real estate development. Drives a BMW X7, lives in a 4,000-square-foot house in Cherry Hills Village with your ex-wife. No criminal record, but he's been interviewed by police 3 times in the past 10 years regarding domestic violence allegations that were later dropped. What kind of allegations? The first 2 were from his ex-wife. Hospital visits for a broken wrist and facial bruising, both times claiming accidents. The third was from a former girlfriend who filed a restraining order then withdrew it a week later after receiving a substantial cash settlement. There's a pattern here. Marco, this man has a problem with women, and he's been getting away with it because he's smart enough to pick victims who won't fight back. Marco leaned back in his chair. Until now, Gilbert agreed. Your sister doesn't fit his usual victim profile. She's got family who care about her, Resources. Gilbert flipped through several pages. Gambling addiction. He loses about $200,000 a year at the casino, but he's careful to spread it around so it doesn't show up as a pattern. He's heavily leveraged on his development projects, which means he's constantly scrambling for cash flow. His business partner, Carrie Ford, handles most of the actual work while Cameron focuses on networking and deal-making. And he's got a drinking problem that's gotten worse since he started living with your ex-wife. What about Marissa? She's not the target here, but she's also not innocent. She knows about Cameron's history. I found records of her researching his background 6 months before she filed for divorce from you. She knew what she was getting into, which means she's either using him for his money or she likes the danger. Marco had suspected as much. Marissa had always been attracted to aggressive men, though he'd been careful never to give her a reason to fear him during their marriage. The thought that she'd deliberately chosen someone with Cameron's history made his ex-wife complicit in what had happened to Jocelyn. What are my options? Marco asked. Gilbert closed the folder and looked directly at Marco. You've got 3 basic approaches: legal, psychological, or permanent. Legal means involving law enforcement, which is slow, public, and uncertain. Psychological means destroying his life through other means: financial, social, professional. Permanent means he disappears and never bothers anyone again. What do you recommend? Depends on what you can live with. If this was just about money or business, I'd recommend psychological warfare. Destroy his credit, sabotage his business relationships, make him unemployable. But he put his hands on your sister and threatened you directly. That's personal. Personal problems require personal solutions. Marco stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city he'd built his life in. 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been expanding his business into new markets. Now he was planning the destruction of a man who had made the mistake of threatening the only family he had left. How would it work? Marco asked without turning around. Accidents happen. Cameron drinks too much, drives expensive cars, and has a history of erratic behavior. A single-car accident on a mountain road wouldn't surprise anyone. Alternatively, there are people in this city who owe him money. Gambling debts create their own problems. Or we could simply make him disappear entirely. Denver's got plenty of construction sites where concrete gets poured every day. Marco turned back to face Gilbert. What about collateral damage? Your ex-wife would become a very wealthy widow. She'd grieve for an appropriate amount of time, then move on with her life. Your sister would be safe. You would never have to worry about Cameron Dunlap again. And the risks? Minimal, if we're careful. I've been doing this for a long time, Marco. I know how to make problems go away without creating new ones. Marco returned to his desk and sat down. The decision should have been difficult, but it wasn't. He'd spent his entire adult life protecting the people he cared about, and he'd learned that sometimes protection required permanent solutions. What do you need from me? Marco asked. Gilbert smiled for the first time since entering the office. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Time, money, and absolute deniability. You're going to need to be somewhere very public with lots of witnesses when this happens. Can you arrange that? I'm supposed to speak at a conference in Las Vegas next weekend. High-profile event, hundreds of attendees. Perfect. That gives us a week to set everything up. By the time you come home, Cameron Dunlap will be a memory. They spent the next hour discussing details, timelines, and contingencies. Gilbert would handle the operational aspects while Marco maintained his normal routine and established his alibi. The payment would be substantial, $200,000, but Marco considered a bargain for permanent peace of mind. As Gilbert prepared to leave, he paused at the office door. One more thing, Marco. Once we do this, there's no going back. If you have any doubts, any second thoughts, now is the time to say so. Marco thought about Jocelyn's voice on the phone, about Cameron's threats, about the look in his sister's eyes when she told him what happened. No doubts, he said. Make it happen. Chapter 4, The Setup. Marco spent the following week maintaining his normal routine while Gilbert worked behind the scenes. To any outside observer, Marco Goff was simply a successful businessman preparing for a high-profile speaking engagement in Las Vegas. He met with clients, reviewed security reports, and spent long hours at the office. The only deviation from his usual schedule was the increased time he spent with Jocelyn, who had moved into his guest bedroom while she recovered from her encounter with Cameron. Jocelyn was healing, but slowly. She'd returned to her classes at CU Boulder, but was jumpy and anxious, constantly checking her phone and looking over her shoulder. Marco had assigned one of his most trusted employees, a former police detective named Benny Andrade, to provide discreet security. Benny posed as a graduate student and shadowed Jocelyn's movements without being obvious about it. "I feel like I'm being paranoid," Jocelyn said on Wednesday evening as they shared dinner at Marco's downtown penthouse. "Part of me wonders if I'm overreacting to what happened." Marco looked up from his pasta. "You're not overreacting. A man twice your size physically assaulted you and made threats. That's not something you get over in a few days. But maybe I shouldn't have gone to the house alone. Maybe I should have." "Stop," Marco said firmly. "What happened wasn't your fault. You were helping family, which is what good people do. Cameron Dunlap is responsible for his actions, not you." Jocelyn nodded, but didn't look convinced. "Have you heard anything from Marissa?" "She hasn't called or texted since that night." Marco had, in fact, heard from Marissa. She'd left 3 voicemails and sent a dozen text messages, all variations on the same theme. Cameron had been drinking, he was sorry, it wouldn't happen again, and couldn't they all just move past this unfortunate misunderstanding? Marco had deleted every message without responding. "Marissa made her choice," Marco said. "She's Cameron's problem now, not ours. It's just weird, you know? For 12 years, she was family, and now it's like she never existed." "People change," Marco said, "or maybe they just show you who they really were all along." While Marco maintained his facade of normalcy, Gilbert was assembling the pieces of his plan. He'd spent the week studying Cameron's routines, mapping his movements, and identifying opportunities. Cameron was a creature of habit. He worked late on Thursday nights, always stopped at the same bar for drinks with clients, and drove home on the same route through the mountains that separated downtown Denver from Cherry Hills Village. The plan Gilbert had developed was elegant in its simplicity. On Thursday evening, Cameron would leave his usual bar after his regular meeting with potential investors. His BMW would develop mechanical problems on Highway 74, a winding mountain road with limited cell phone coverage. When Cameron got out to investigate, he would encounter Gilbert, who would be posing as a helpful motorist. The rest would happen quickly and quietly. Cameron's body would be found in his car at the bottom of a ravine, the victim of an apparent accident caused by mechanical failure and excessive alcohol consumption. The investigation would be perfunctory. Drunk driving accidents on mountain roads were unfortunately common in Colorado, and Cameron's blood alcohol level would support the conclusion that he'd simply lost control of his vehicle. Gilbert had even arranged for the mechanical failure to be authentic. A small device attached to the BMW's brake line would cause a slow leak that would become critical at precisely the right moment. To any investigator, it would appear that Cameron had been driving on worn brake pads, a maintenance issue that his own negligence had caused. The beauty of the plan was its plausibility. Cameron had a history of drinking and driving. His car was due for maintenance, and the mountain roads were notoriously dangerous. No one would suspect murder because there would be no evidence of murder. On Thursday afternoon, Gilbert called Marco to confirm the final details. "Everything's in place," he said. "Your boy will be taking his last drive tonight." Marco was in his office, reviewing his presentation for the Las Vegas conference. In 12 hours, he would be on a plane to Nevada, surrounded by witnesses who could confirm his whereabouts when Cameron Dunlap died. Any last-minute complications? None. He's following his usual routine, and I've got eyes on him now. This time tomorrow, your problem will be solved. After the call, Marco found himself staring out his office window at the mountains where Cameron would die. He felt no guilt, no second thoughts, no moral qualms about what was about to happen. Cameron Dunlap had threatened Jocelyn and made the fatal mistake of thinking Marco Goff was the kind of man who made empty threats. He wasn't. At 6 p.m., Marco left his office and drove to Jocelyn's apartment to take her to dinner. She'd been cooking for herself all week, claiming she needed the distraction, but Marco wanted to make sure she was eating properly. They went to her favorite restaurant, a small Italian place near the CU campus where the owner knew her by name. "You seem different tonight," Jocelyn said as they waited for their food. "More relaxed." "I'm looking forward to the conference," Marco lied. "It's good for business." "When do you leave?" "Early flight tomorrow morning. I'll be back Sunday evening." Jocelyn nodded, then looked down at her hands. "Marco, what's going to happen with Cameron? Are you going to press charges, or—" "I'm going to handle it," Marco said. "You don't need to worry about Cameron Dunlap anymore." "What does that mean?" Marco reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "It means you're safe. That's all you need to know." They ate dinner and talked about Jocelyn's classes, her friends, her plans for the summer. Normal sibling conversation that felt surreal given what Marco knew was happening across town. At 8:30, he walked her back to her apartment, hugged her goodnight, and drove home to pack for his trip. At 9:15, Cameron Dunlap left his office for his weekly meeting with investors at Murphy's Pub downtown. At 9:45, he was 3 drinks into what would be his last evening alive. And at 10:30, Gilbert Perkins was making final preparations for an encounter that would solve Marco Goff's problem permanently. Chapter 5: The Night. Cameron Dunlap was feeling good as he left Murphy's Pub at 11:20 p.m. The meeting with the investors had gone better than expected. They were interested in his latest development project, a luxury condominium complex in Thornton that would net him a substantial profit if the financing came through. The 3 scotches he'd consumed during dinner had left him loose and confident, certain that his life was finally coming together. The engagement to Marissa had been the right move. She was beautiful, intelligent, and came from money, all qualities that enhanced his social standing in Denver's business community. The fact that she was recently divorced from Marco Goff actually worked in Cameron's favor. Marco had a reputation as a tough, unforgiving man, which made Cameron's ability to steal his ex-wife seem like a victory worth bragging about. The only fly in the ointment was the situation with Marco's sister. Cameron knew he'd handled that badly, letting his temper and the alcohol get the better of him. But the girl had been asking too many questions about his business, and Cameron suspected that Marco was using her to gather information. The message he'd sent, both to the girl and to Marco when he'd called, had been necessary to establish boundaries. Still, Cameron was starting to think he might need to smooth things over. Marissa had been upset when she'd learned about the incident, though she'd accepted his explanation that Jocelyn had been dramatic and hysterical. Women were like that, Cameron knew. They exaggerated every little thing and turned minor misunderstandings into major crises. As he walked to his BMW in the parking lot behind Murphy's, Cameron was already planning his next move. Maybe he'd send Jocelyn some flowers with an apology note. Nothing too elaborate, just enough to show that he was the bigger man. It would make Marissa happy and might even convince Marco to back off. Cameron climbed into his BMW and started the engine, turning up the heat to combat the October chill. The dashboard clock read 11:25 p.m. He'd be home by midnight if traffic cooperated. Marissa would probably be asleep, but he might wake her up for some celebration sex. The investor meeting had put him in an aggressive mood. He pulled out of the parking lot and headed west toward Highway 74, the scenic mountain route that would take him home to Cherry Hills Village. The road was less traveled than the main highways, but Cameron enjoyed the curves and elevation changes that let him test his BMW's performance. Tonight, with 3 scotches warming his blood, the drive felt like a fitting end to a successful evening. Gilbert Perkins had been waiting in the shadows near Murphy's Pub since 9 p.m., watching the investor meeting through the restaurant's windows. He'd identified the targets 2 hours earlier, 3 middle-aged men in expensive suits who matched the descriptions in Cameron's business files. Gilbert had also confirmed that Cameron was drinking heavily, which would make the rest of the evening's events more believable. At 11:15, Gilbert had excused himself from his position near the restaurant and driven his rented Toyota Camry to a predetermined location on Highway 74. The spot he'd chosen was perfect for his purposes, a sharp curve with a steep drop-off, minimal lighting, and no nearby houses. Cell phone coverage was spotty, which would delay any calls for help. Gilbert parked the Camry on the shoulder and activated its hazard lights, then popped the hood to create the appearance of mechanical trouble. He pulled on latex gloves, checked his equipment one final time, and settled in to wait. At 11:32, Cameron's BMW appeared around the curve, its headlights sweeping across Gilbert's disabled vehicle. Cameron slowed and pulled to a stop behind the Camry, then climbed out of his car to offer assistance. "Car trouble," Cameron called out, his voice slightly slurred from alcohol. Gilbert looked up from under the Camry's hood, playing the role of frustrated motorist. "Yeah, she just died on me. You wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" "I think so," Cameron said, walking toward his BMW's trunk. "Let me check." That was when Gilbert struck. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had killed in a dozen different countries, using techniques learned in military training and refined through years of field experience. Cameron never saw the attack coming. One moment he was opening his trunk, and the next he was unconscious on the asphalt with a crushed windpipe. Gilbert worked quickly, using the next 15 minutes to stage the scene. He dragged Cameron's body back to the BMW and positioned it behind the steering wheel, then disabled the brake system using a small device that would cause total brake failure. The device was designed to self-destruct after activation, leaving no evidence of sabotage. Next, Gilbert poured additional alcohol into Cameron's mouth and on his clothing, ensuring that the autopsy would show a blood alcohol level consistent with the accident scenario. He placed Cameron's foot on the accelerator and released the parking brake, then stepped back as the BMW rolled forward toward the curve. The car gathered speed as it approached the guardrail, broke through the barrier, and plunged down the steep slope toward the creek below. The impact was tremendous. The BMW rolled 3 times before coming to rest against a cluster of pine trees, its front end completely crushed. Gilbert cleaned up his staging area, packed his equipment into the Camry, and drove away. To any investigator, the scene would tell a simple story. A drunk driver had lost control on a dangerous curve and paid the ultimate price for his negligence. At 11:47 p.m., Cameron Dunlap was officially dead, though his body wouldn't be discovered until the following afternoon when a park ranger noticed the broken guardrail and investigated. Marco Goff was 38,000 feet above Utah when Cameron died, reviewing his presentation notes and sipping coffee in the first-class cabin of a United Airlines flight to Las Vegas. His phone was in airplane mode, which meant he wouldn't learn about Cameron's accident until he landed at McCarran International Airport. When the call finally came, at 2:30 p.m. Pacific time on Friday afternoon, Marco was in his hotel room at the Bellagio, preparing for his evening keynote address. The caller was Detective Philip Brock from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. "Mr. Goff, I'm calling about Cameron Dunlap. I understand he was engaged to your ex-wife." "That's correct," Marco said, keeping his voice neutral. "Has something happened?" "I'm afraid Mr. Dunlap was killed in a car accident last night. His vehicle went off Highway 74 around midnight. We're still investigating, but it appears he may have been drinking." Marco sat down heavily on the hotel bed, projecting the shock and confusion that would be expected from someone receiving such news. "My God, is Marissa all right? Does she know? She's been notified. We found your contact information in Mr. Dunlap's phone, listed as an emergency contact. We're calling everyone who might have information about his activities last night." "I'm in Las Vegas for a business conference," Marco said. "I flew out yesterday morning. But if there's anything I can do to help, we may have some follow-up questions, but right now, it looks like a straightforward accident. Drunk driving, dangerous roads, it happens more often than you'd think." After the call ended, Marco sat in his hotel room for several minutes, staring at his reflection in the mirror across from the bed. He felt no guilt, no remorse, no second thoughts about what he'd done. Cameron Dunlap had threatened Jocelyn and learned that some men don't make empty promises. The problem was solved. Permanently. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. The funeral was held on Tuesday afternoon at a non-denominational chapel in downtown Denver. Marco attended out of what he called respect for Marissa's grief, though his real motivation was intelligence gathering. He wanted to see who came to mourn Cameron Dunlap, what they said about him, and how Marissa was handling her sudden widowhood. The turnout was modest, perhaps 50 people, mostly business associates and a few neighbors from Cherry Hills Village. Cameron's ex-wife and adult children were notably absent, which told Marco everything he needed to know about the kind of man Cameron had been even before the violence started. Marissa played the grieving fiancé perfectly, dressed in an elegant black dress and accepting condolences with dignified composure. But Marco noticed details that others missed. The way she checked her phone during the service, the calculating look in her eyes when Cameron's business partner discussed the future of their development projects, and the fact that she wasn't wearing her engagement ring. "Thank you for coming," Marissa said when she approached Marco after the service. "I know you and Cameron had your differences. I'm sorry for your loss," Marco replied, meaning nothing by it. "If there's anything you need." "Actually, there is something. Could we talk privately? Maybe dinner this week?" Marco studied her face, wondering what she was planning. "I don't think that's appropriate, Marissa. You're grieving, and we're divorced for good reasons." "Please, Marco, it's important. There are things about Cameron that I need to tell someone, and you're the only person who might understand." Against his better judgment, Marco agreed to meet her for dinner on Thursday evening at a neutral restaurant downtown. He told himself it was operational security. He needed to know what Marissa suspected about Cameron's death and whether she posed any threat to his carefully constructed alibi. The dinner meeting took place at the Palace Arms in the Brown Palace Hotel, an upscale restaurant where they were unlikely to encounter anyone from their former social circle. Marissa arrived 20 minutes late, wearing a red dress that was inappropriate for a recent widow, but perfectly calculated to remind Marco of what he'd lost in the divorce. "You look good," she said as she sat down across from him. "Success agrees with you. What did you want to talk about, Marissa?" She ordered a glass of wine before answering, taking her time to study Marco's face. Cameron's death wasn't an accident. Marco kept his expression neutral, though internally he was shifting in a high alert. "What makes you say that?" "Because I know Cameron. He was an asshole, but he was a careful asshole. He never drove drunk. He always called an Uber when he'd been drinking. And his car was serviced 2 weeks ago. There's no way the brakes just failed. The police investigation concluded it was an accident." "Are you saying they're wrong?" "I'm saying Cameron had enemies. Business enemies, gambling debts, ex-girlfriends with violent boyfriends. The list is longer than you'd think." Marissa leaned forward, lowering her voice. "But I keep coming back to the timing. He assaults your sister, threatens you, and then dies in a convenient accident less than a week later. That's not a coincidence, Marco." Marco sipped a scotch, buying time to formulate his response. "If you believe Cameron was murdered, you should talk to the police, not to me. I can't go to the police because I don't have proof. And even if I did, I'm not sure I'd want Cameron's killer caught." Marissa's smile was cold and calculating. "You see, Cameron's death solved several problems for me. I inherit everything: the house, the business interests, the life insurance. I'm a very wealthy widow, and I didn't have to endure years of abuse to get there." "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Cameron was a violent sociopath who would have eventually escalated to serious assault or worse. Whoever killed him did the world a favor. The question is, what does that person want in return for their public service?" Marco set down his glass and looked directly at Marissa. "Are you trying to blackmail me?" "I'm trying to have a conversation with my ex-husband about our mutual benefit. Cameron's dead, I'm rich, and you've eliminated a threat to your sister. Everyone wins. But I think we could both win more if we work together. What did you have in mind?" Marissa reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, which she slid across the table. Cameron kept detailed records of his business dealings. Financial statements, investor agreements, profit projections. Some of it is legitimately valuable. The Thornton development project alone is worth $12 million. But some of it is problematic. Marco opened the envelope and flipped through the documents inside. Most were standard business papers, but several showed clear evidence of fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. Cameron had been skimming from investor funds and hiding assets in offshore accounts. Cameron was stealing from his partners, Marissa continued. Millions of dollars over the past 5 years. If this information became public, it would destroy his business and send several people to prison. But if it stayed private, you want me to help you cover up Cameron's crimes? I want you to help me take over Cameron's business interests legally and quietly. You have the resources and connections to make that happen. In return, I'll make sure no one ever asks uncomfortable questions about Cameron's death. Marco closed the envelope and pushed it back across the table. I'm not interested in partnering with you, Marissa. Cameron's business problems died with him, and his death was investigated by competent professionals who reached their own conclusions. Are you sure about that? Because I have other evidence you might find interesting. Phone records showing Cameron received several threatening calls in the week before he died. Security camera footage from his office building that shows him meeting with someone who matches the description of a man you've used for corporate security work. Marco's expression didn't change, but internally he was recalculating the threat Marissa represented. She was better informed than he'd given her credit for, which meant she was more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Let me be very clear about something, Marco said quietly. I had nothing to do with Cameron's death. But even if I had, attempting to blackmail me would be the last mistake you ever made. I don't negotiate with people who threaten me or my family. Marissa's confident smile faltered slightly. Marco, I'm not threatening you. I'm offering you a partnership. We both know what really happened to Cameron, and we both benefited from it. Why not make the benefits official? Marco stood up, dropping enough cash on the table to cover both their drinks. Because I don't do business with people I can't trust. And I learned during our marriage that you can't be trusted with anything that matters. He started to leave, then turned back. One more thing, Marissa. If you ever contact my sister again, if you ever mention Cameron's death to anyone, if you ever try to cause problems for me or my family in any way, you'll discover that Cameron's accident wasn't the only unfortunate event that can happen to people who threaten the wrong person. Marco left the restaurant without looking back, his mind already working on the problem Marissa had just become. She was smart, ruthless, and greedy, a dangerous combination in someone who suspected the truth about Cameron's death. Gilbert had eliminated one threat, but another had just emerged from the shadows. This one would require a more sophisticated solution. Chapter 7. The Widow's Gambit. 3 weeks after Cameron's funeral, Marissa Skinner made her first major mistake. She contacted Jocelyn directly, requesting a meeting to clear the air about what had happened between Jocelyn and Cameron before his death. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Jocelyn was studying in the library at CU Boulder. I know this is awkward, Marissa said, her voice carefully modulated to sound caring and concerned. But I've been thinking about what Cameron told me happened that night, and I feel like there might have been some misunderstandings. Jocelyn had immediately called Marco, who was in a client meeting when his phone buzzed with her text. Marissa called. She wants to meet. What should I do? Marco excused himself from the meeting and called Jocelyn back. What exactly did she say? She wants to meet for coffee to talk about Cameron. She said she's been feeling guilty about what happened and wants to apologize. It seems sincere, but you don't trust her. No, I don't. There was something in her voice like she was reading from script. And why would she wait 3 weeks after the funeral to call me? Marco's instincts were screaming warnings. Marissa's timing was too convenient, her motivations too suspect. This wasn't about guilt or apologies. It was about gathering information or setting up some kind of manipulation. Don't meet with her, Marco said. If she really wanted to apologize, she would have done it weeks ago. She's fishing for something. That's what I was thinking. But Marco, what if she knows something about Cameron's accident? What if she's trying to? Trying to what? I don't know. But she mentioned that Cameron had told her his version of what happened that night. What if she's trying to get my version to see if they match? Marco felt a chill of recognition. Marissa wasn't just fishing randomly. She was building a case, gathering evidence to support her suspicions about Cameron's death. The call to Jocelyn was an attempt to find inconsistencies she could exploit. I'm going to handle this, Marco said. Don't return her call, don't meet with her, and if she contacts you again, let me know immediately. That evening, Marco met with Gilbert Perkins at a coffee shop in Lodo, away from both their usual haunts. Gilbert listened without interruption as Marco described Marissa's dinner proposition and her subsequent contact with Jocelyn. She's building leverage, Gilbert said when Marco finished. The meeting with you was a fishing expedition. She wanted to see how you'd react to accusations about Cameron's death. When you didn't bite, she moved to a more vulnerable target. What's her endgame? Money, probably. She inherits Cameron's assets, but most of his business interests are tied up in partnerships and ongoing projects. If she can prove that Cameron was murdered, she might be able to claim additional life insurance benefits or sue his business partners for wrongful death. You'd be a bonus. She could blackmail you for a substantial amount while pursuing other revenue streams. Marco stirred his coffee, thinking through the implications. How much of a threat is she? Depends on what evidence she actually has. The phone records and security footage she mentioned could be legitimate, or she could be bluffing. Either way, she's not going to go away voluntarily. Women like Marissa see opportunity in every crisis, and Cameron's death represents a significant opportunity for her. What are my options? Gilbert's pale eyes were expressionless. Same as before. Legal, psychological, or permanent. But this one's trickier because she's your ex-wife. Her death would automatically make you a suspect, especially so soon after Cameron's accident. What about the psychological approach? We could destroy her credibility, make her look like a greedy widow grasping at conspiracy theories. Plant evidence that she was having affairs during her engagement to Cameron suggests that she murdered him herself for the inheritance. But that's risky. If she really does have evidence against you, destroying her credibility might not be enough to protect you. Marco considered his options. Marissa was smart, motivated, and increasingly dangerous. She'd already demonstrated a willingness to manipulate Jocelyn, which crossed a line Marco wouldn't tolerate. But killing her would create more problems than it solved, at least in the short term. I want you to investigate her, Marco decided. Phone records, financial statements, personal relationships, everything. Find out what evidence she actually has and who else she might have talked to about her suspicions. And then we'll decide how permanent our solution needs to be. Gilbert spent the next week conducting surveillance on Marissa, tracking her movements and monitoring her communications. What he discovered was both reassuring and alarming. Marissa hadn't contacted law enforcement about her suspicions, which suggested she was more interested in personal profit than justice. But she had been researching Marco's business associates, particularly those with military or security backgrounds. She'd also been meeting regularly with Carrie Ford, Cameron's business partner, who was facing financial ruin now that Cameron's fraud was becoming apparent. Ford needed a scapegoat for the missing investor funds, and a murder conspiracy would provide the perfect distraction from his own potential criminal liability. She's building a coalition, Gilbert reported during their next meeting. Ford needs someone to blame for the business collapse, and Marissa needs allies to give her accusations credibility. They're probably planning to go to the authorities together, a grieving widow and a betrayed business partner presenting evidence of a murder conspiracy. Timeline: soon. Ford's creditors are circling, and the IRS is starting to ask questions about the missing money. He needs to act before his own crimes become undeniable. Marco made his decision. I want both problems solved. Ford and Marissa together. That's ambitious. 2 deaths in such a short time frame will raise questions. Then don't make them look like murders. Can you arrange a murder-suicide? Ford kills Marissa, then himself, out of guilt over Cameron's death and the business fraud. Gilbert smiled his cold, predatory smile. Now you're thinking like a professional. Yes, that could work. Ford's under tremendous stress, facing bankruptcy and possible prison time. Marissa's been pressuring him about the murder conspiracy. He snaps, kills her, then kills himself rather than face the consequences. How long do you need? A week to set up the scenario properly. Ford and Marissa need to be in the same place at the same time, with evidence that they were arguing about something significant. I'll need to plant physical evidence that supports the murder-suicide narrative and ensure that their deaths can't be traced back to outside intervention. Marco felt the familiar calm that came with making difficult decisions. Marissa had forced his hand by threatening Jocelyn and attempting to blackmail him. Ford was collateral damage, a necessary casualty to maintain the integrity of the overall plan. Do it, Marco said, and make sure it's convincing. I don't want any more surprises. Chapter 8. The Final Solution. Carrie Ford was a weak man trapped in an impossible situation. At 53, he'd spent his entire adult life building a real estate development business that was now collapsing around him. Cameron Dunlap's death had exposed years of financial fraud that Ford had either ignored or actively participated in, and the missing investor funds were creating legal problems that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. When Marissa had first approached him with her suspicions about Cameron's death, Ford had seen it as a potential lifeline. If they could prove that Cameron had been murdered, it might create enough legal confusion to delay the fraud investigation and give Ford time to find alternative solutions. But as the days passed, Ford was beginning to realize that Marissa's murder conspiracy theory was probably accurate, and that made him an accessory to blackmail against someone who'd already killed twice. The meeting took place on Saturday evening at Ford's office in a downtown high-rise, ostensibly to review the financial documents that Marissa claimed would prove Marco Goff's involvement in Cameron's death. Ford had agreed to the meeting reluctantly, knowing that he was probably signing his own death warrant but unable to see any other options. Marissa arrived at 7 p.m., carrying a briefcase full of documents and wearing the confident expression of someone who believed she held all the cards. She'd spent the week building her case against Marco, compiling phone records, financial statements, and witness testimonies that she believed would force him to pay for her silence. "I think we're ready to approach Marco with our proposal," she said as she spread documents across Ford's conference table. "Between your testimony about Cameron's business practices and my evidence about the murder, we should be able to negotiate a substantial settlement." Ford poured himself a scotch from the bottle he kept in his desk drawer, his hands shaking slightly. "Marissa, I need to ask you something. Are you absolutely certain that Marco Goff killed Cameron?" "As certain as I can be without witnessing it myself. The timing, the method, the convenient alibi, it all fits. Marco had motive, means, and opportunity, and he's exactly the kind of man who would solve problems with violence. And you're not worried about what he might do to us when we confront him?" Marissa's smile was cold and calculating. "Marco's a businessman, Carrie. He'll do a cost-benefit analysis and realize that paying us is cheaper than dealing with a murder investigation. Besides, we have insurance. If anything happens to either of us, all our evidence goes directly to the FBI." What Marissa didn't know was that Gilbert Perkins had been monitoring her preparations for the past week. Her insurance policy consisted of a safe deposit box containing copies of her documents and a letter to be opened in the event of her death. Gilbert had identified the bank, bribed a security guard to provide access schedules, and determined that the contents could be retrieved and destroyed within hours of Marissa's death. Ford's office building was nearly empty on Saturday evening, which made Gilbert's approach much simpler. He'd already disabled the security cameras on Ford's floor and identified the building's blind spots. Dressed as a maintenance worker, he'd gained access through a service entrance and made his way to Ford's office undetected. At 7:30 p.m., Gilbert entered the office through an unlocked door, moving silently across the carpeted floor. Ford and Marissa were so focused on their documents that they didn't notice his presence until he was standing directly behind them. "Good evening," Gilbert said quietly. Marissa spun around, her face going pale as she recognized the man from Cameron's office building security footage. "I'm a solution to Mr. Goff's problem," Gilbert replied. "Both of his problems." Ford dropped his scotch glass, the crystal shattering on the hardwood floor. "Look, whatever Marco is paying you, I can double it, triple it. Just let us walk away." "I'm afraid that's not possible. You've both demonstrated that you can't be trusted to leave well enough alone. Mr. Goff requires permanent solutions to permanent problems." What followed was quick and efficient. Gilbert had brought Ford's registered handgun, which he'd retrieved from Ford's home office earlier that week. The murder-suicide scenario required specific ballistics evidence and gunshot residue patterns that could only be achieved with Ford's own weapon. Marissa died first, a single gunshot to the chest that would have been instantly fatal. Ford followed 30 seconds later, the gun placed in his hand and fired through his temple at point-blank range. Gilbert spent another 10 minutes arranging the scene, scattering the documents to suggest a violent argument, and positioning the bodies to support the narrative he'd constructed. The story the police would discover was simple and believable. Carrie Ford had been facing financial ruin due to Cameron Dunlap's fraud. When Marissa had approached him with evidence of additional criminal activity, Ford had realized that his situation was hopeless. Rather than face bankruptcy, imprisonment, and public humiliation, he'd chosen to silence his accuser and then take his own life. Gilbert completed his work and left the building the same way he'd entered, undetected and unrecorded. The bodies wouldn't be discovered until Monday morning when Ford's secretary arrived for work, giving Gilbert plenty of time to retrieve and destroy Marissa's insurance policy documents. Marco learned about the deaths on Monday afternoon, when Detective Philip Brock called to inform him that his ex-wife had been killed in what appeared to be a murder-suicide related to Cameron Dunlap's business affairs. "We're still investigating," Brock said, but it looks like Ford was facing serious financial problems related to Dunlap's development projects. Mrs. Skinner may have been pressuring him about irregularities in the business records. "That's terrible," Marco said, injecting appropriate shock and sadness into his voice. First Cameron, now Marissa. This has been a devastating few months for everyone who knew them. We may need to ask you some follow-up questions about your ex-wife's state of mind and her relationship with Ford. Would you be available later this week? Of course. Whatever I can do to help. After the call ended, Marco sat in his office for several minutes, contemplating the elegant simplicity of Gilbert's solution. 3 people who had threatened his family were now dead, and none of their deaths could be traced back to him. Cameron's accident had been followed by Ford's breakdown and murder-suicide, creating a neat narrative that law enforcement could follow without uncovering any inconvenient truths. The investigation would conclude that Cameron Dunlap had been a corrupt businessman whose death had triggered a series of unfortunate events among his associates. Cary Ford would be remembered as a weak man who'd chosen violence over accountability. And Marissa would be seen as an unlucky widow who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marco Goff would be regarded as a victim of circumstance, a successful businessman whose ex-wife had become entangled with dangerous people after their divorce. No one would suspect that he'd orchestrated the deaths of 3 people to protect his sister and maintain his own freedom. Chapter 9. The Unforgiving. 6 months after Marissa's death, Marco Goff stood in the cemetery where all 3 of his enemies were buried. Cameron Dunlap's grave was marked by an expensive granite headstone paid for by his life insurance policy. Cary Ford marker was smaller and simpler, purchased by distant relatives who'd wanted to avoid further scandal. Marissa's grave bore an elaborate monument that she'd probably chosen herself, knowing her taste for dramatic gestures. Marco felt no satisfaction looking at their graves, no sense of completion or closure. These weren't victories to be celebrated. They were problems that had been solved efficiently and permanently. The dead couldn't threaten Jocelyn, couldn't blackmail him, couldn't disrupt the life he'd built through decades of careful planning and ruthless execution. Jocelyn was thriving. She'd finished her sophomore year with a 3.8 GPA and was spending the summer interning at a graphic design firm in Boulder. The trauma of her encounter with Cameron had faded, replaced by the natural resilience of youth and the security that came from knowing her brother would protect her from any threat. She'd never asked Marco what had happened to Cameron, Marissa, or Ford. Some questions were better left unasked. Marco's business had continued to grow. The tragedy of losing 3 people connected to his personal life had actually enhanced his reputation in certain circles. Clients who needed serious security work were impressed by a man who understood firsthand how quickly violence could erupt and how devastating the consequences could be. His company now employed 47 people and maintained offices in 3 states. Gilbert Perkins had returned to his usual work, solving problems for clients who could afford his particular skills. He and Marco maintained contact, though they never discussed the events of the previous fall. Their professional relationship was based on mutual respect and absolute discretion, qualities that made Gilbert invaluable for future situations that might require permanent solutions. The police investigations had concluded exactly as planned. Cameron's death was officially ruled an accident caused by mechanical failure and driver impairment. The murder-suicide of Marissa and Ford was attributed to financial stress and Ford's deteriorating mental state. No evidence had been found linking any of the deaths to outside intervention, and no one had raised questions about Marco's potential involvement. As Marco walked back to his car, he reflected on the lessons learned from his first venture into personal justice. Violence was a tool like any other. It could be used precisely and effectively, or clumsily and destructively. The key was preparation, patience, and a willingness to follow through completely unnecessary actions. His phone rang as he reached his BMW. The caller ID showed Jocelyn's name. "Hey," she said when he answered. "Are you still coming to dinner tonight? I'm making your favorite pasta. Wouldn't miss it. How was your day at the internship?" "Amazing. My supervisor said I have real talent for commercial design. She's thinking about offering me a part-time position during the school year." Marco smiled, hearing the excitement in his sister's voice. This was what mattered: protecting the people he loved, ensuring their futures, maintaining the stability that allowed them to pursue their dreams without fear. "That's fantastic, Jock. We'll celebrate tonight. Also, I wanted to thank you again for everything you did last year. I know it was a difficult time with Cameron and Marissa and all the legal complications, but you handled everything perfectly. I never felt unsafe, not even for a minute." "That's what family does," Marco said. "We protect each other." After ending the call, Marco drove toward Jocelyn's apartment, thinking about the future. There would be other threats, other challenges, other people who might mistake his protective instinct for weakness. They would learn, as Cameron, Marissa, and Ford had learned, that Marco Goff was not a man who made empty threats or accepted half measures. He was a man who solved problems permanently. The city lights were beginning to flicker on as Marco navigated through downtown Denver traffic, heading toward an evening with the only person whose opinion mattered to him. Behind him, 3 graves held the remains of people who'd thought they could threaten his family and negotiate from positions of strength. They'd been wrong. In Marco's world, there were no second chances, no forgiveness for betrayal, and no mercy for those who crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. He was exactly what his enemies had failed to understand: a man who believed that some problems could only be solved through absolute and uncompromising action. Marco Goff was unforgiving by nature and by choice. It was the foundation of everything he'd built, everything he'd protected, and everything he would do in the future to ensure that his family remained safe in a dangerous world. The dead had learned that lesson too late. The living would hopefully be wiser.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.